pub, talk tech over pints. Evan and Beto, their minds bright with light. Apache Superset, data flows like streams. Queries and engines, all part of their dreams. Designated driver, tech talk and stout. Irish tunes in the background, cheers and no doubt.
Everybody, welcome to our fifth episode of Designated Driver. Today you'll notice there's only two of us, which makes this a very special episode. We don't have a third-party guest from a third-party database. In fact, we have Beto Almeida joining us, the author of Shillelah, which everybody should know and love if they're Superset users.
Hey.
Yeah, Beto, you and I usually introduce yourselves. Is there any initial introductions you'd like to make about Shillelah or its name or anything like that to start?
Yeah. So I wrote Shillelah for Superset, which I think it's an interesting thing to talk about in this episode. It was developed for Superset, and the name, if you're not familiar, it's an Irish word for like a stick, a club, and yeah, it's also a Dungeons and Dragons spell. I think it's a cantrip these days. So that's where I learned the word Shillelah. I didn't know how to pronounce it, but that's where I got the word. I played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, and I knew the spell, so that's where it comes from.
This is something we had in common, right? We were both druids back in our D&D days.
Exactly. I mean, I'm still in my D&D days, but yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm afraid to go back in that rabbit hole. So, did you bring a beer with you today, perchance?
Well, since Shillelah is an Irish word, I have with me a Guinness Extra Stout.
Oh, the bottle, not the can. Fancy.
Yeah. I was in the mood for a bottle, you know. It's different drinking from a bottle, drinking from a glass.
It is. But and similarly, going Irish, I have a Sullivan's Brewing Maltings Irish Ale, which I guess is an Irish red ale. But
oh, nice. That's a beautiful can.
Yeah, they did a nice job with the packaging. It actually has like a texture to it, which is kind of a trip.
Interesting.
But yeah, let's get into it. I guess I have to pour mine because I brought the English glass, which might actually be a cardinal sin to the Irish beer. But
yeah, I only have Hard Rock Cafe glasses at home to drink beer.
Okay.
So
sláinte.
Well, sláinte. But yeah, it's good we open a beer because Shillelah has like a long story with Superset.
Okay, yeah, and it's Friday, and it's officially
Friday.
Afternoon, so it's all very fitting. So yeah, tell us the backstory of Shillelah. What were its initial origins? What was the aha moment there?
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why I chose like Shillelah, you know, for the name, because it's a druid spell, and it's not just because I like druids, but like Superset started as a web interface to the Druid database, right? So it started as a hackathon project at Airbnb, and Airbnb was using Druid, and then Max Beauchemin, he was like, hey, it would be really nice, you know, if you could look at data from Druid. So he built this web UI in like a week or a weekend, and in the beginning, Druid didn't support SQL, so it was a very different product because Superset which was also not called Superset, it was called Caravel? Panoramix. No, Panoramix was the first thing.
It had both names. I don't know the sequence of the two.
I think Panoramix. So it was called Panoramix because Panoramix, if you're not familiar with Asterix and Obelix, he's also a druid, right? So if you read the comics, these are like French comics, Belgian, I think.
I never read those, so this is news to me.
Yeah, so Panoramix is a druid. He's the one that makes the potions that Asterix gets super strong. So Max called the product Panoramix, and since Druid, the database didn't support SQL, Superset would send like a JSON payload. You know, it was a REST interface. You would basically say, I want these metrics, I want these group bys, I want these filters, just like SQL, but it was JSON. And it started growing. It got renamed to Caravelle, and then eventually got renamed to Superset. And at some point in that process, people were saying, "Hey, this is a really cool product. I want to connect it to my SQL database. I want to connect it to Hive, or I don't know what was the first SQL database." So then a concept of a connector was added. So like, okay, we can talk to Druid and we can talk to any SQL database as long as you have a SQL Alchemy dialect, right? So SQL Alchemy is nice because it offers this interface to 50 different databases or more. And for a long time, there was this two code paths. If you wanted to send Druid a query, okay, we need to create JSON. We need to represent metrics as JSON. Let's send it down the wire. And if you're querying a SQL database, then, okay, you define your metrics using SQL and you send SQL down the wire, right? And it was hard to maintain that. Every feature we added, we need to support both cases. It was very complicated. And then when I started working in Superset in 2017, the first thing Max told me was like, "Hey, can you add support for Druid, but with SQL? We need to get rid of this because it's super hard to maintain. Can you add support for SQL so that we get rid of the old code path and all we do is talk to SQL Alchemy?" So I was like, "Yeah, sure." And I was like, "Okay, so I need to write like a middle layer that gets SQL from Superset and then builds these JSON requests that Druid is expecting." So I think I worked on it for a week before Max asked me like, "Hey, how is it going?" And I was like, "Well, this is not trivial. I need to like build a SQL parser and then build like a translator to generate JSON." And then he said, "What are you talking about? Like Druid supports SQL?" And I was like, "Oh, I didn't know." So it was a new feature. Druid, they used the calcite library. They added support for SQL. So there was an endpoint now that you could just send SQL and it would work. So my work was much easier. But the work I had started, I called it Shillelagh because I was like, okay, I need to talk to Druid. I need to get SQL and send it to Druid. So I thought Shillelagh was a good name because you're kind of like hitting the database to accept SQL. You're like forcing SQL into something that doesn't take SQL.
Persuading it with a stick, as one does with
exactly. Yeah. So I thought Shillelagh was a good name because you're kind of like hitting, hammering. I wouldn't say hammering because it's not a hammer, but you're like forcing something. It's like, okay, you don't take SQL, but let's push SQL. So the work was much easier because okay, Druid has a SQL interface. So I kind of put Shillelagh aside, and I just did like a Python driver or SQL Alchemy dialect, and it was much easier because all you need to do is send SQL and then read the results back. So it was much easier. I didn't have to do parsing. I didn't have to do transpilation, anything like that. But I put the project aside. I had the repo, and I was always interested in having a library that can take SQL and generate API calls, right? I was like, this is a powerful concept. Because Superset talks SQL, and every time you're like, okay, how can I query data from GitHub? How can I query data from Google Sheets? How can I query data, from pandas? I don't know. The answer is you can't. You need to talk to something that knows SQL. So I wanted to do that library to kind of open up the possibilities that Superset had to connect to data sources without having to change anything in Superset, right? That's the beauty.
Right. And then you largely accomplished that. I know from our prior discussions and stuff we're building, which we can talk about a little bit, I guess. It does connect to the GitHub API without feeling like an API. You can just say, get me these PRs where they meet these conditions, things like that. And JSON API endpoints, XML API endpoints, CSV files. What else? What am I forgetting? It connects to a lot of things.
Yeah. So I think the first big API was Google Sheets. I was looking at Lyft. A lot of people had data in Google Sheets, and they kept asking me like, "Hey, I want to create a chart, and I want to, show my data that is in Google Sheets. How do I do that?" And I would say, don't do that because Google Sheets is not a database. There's no guarantees, and you should really put your data in, I don't know, Druid or Hive, or which is insane, because like people don't want to put their data in Hive or any database, normal people. And then at some point I gave up. Like, people were like, hey, how do I look at my Google Sheets data? And I said, you know what, I'm going to build Shillelagh, and I'm going to make it so it connects to Google Sheets, and then basically you can query any URL of a Google Sheet, and it should return data. It understands label, so if your first row is like country revenue, it will use that as a column name. So that was the first big one, but I suffer a little bit of that thing engineers have, where I try to generalize maybe too much. So I was like, okay, I want to have a concept of an adapter, which is like what talks to APIs. And I try to hide all the complexity, so it's really easy to write new adapters. So I was worried about my users. I wanted my users to have a good experience, but I was also thinking about other developers. And I was like, okay, if somebody wants to support a new API, I want it to be as simple as possible. So I abstracted all the complexity, and like, if you want to support a new API, you can add support in a few minutes. And it's probably going to be inefficient, and then you can iterate and make it more optimal, download and request as little data as possible. So that takes more work, but then it's more efficient, right? So there's support for, so like third-party support that other people added for like GraphQL. So there's a GraphQL adapter, so you can run SQL against your GraphQL endpoint. Airtable is a big one. Google Sheets, I mentioned. There's a generic JSON adapter, so any API that returns JSON, you can fetch data. You can scrape HTML tables. You can read CSV files. You can read from S3. If you're reading from S3, it will even use the S3 select endpoint, so it will filter the data on their server side, right? Because a lot of the work you want to do is with the adapter, you can be very dumb and just fetch the data all the time. But you want to, like I said, you want to do as much processing as you can. You want to push that to the server.
Right. And I guess it's kind of to that end, if you're using the XML adapter, you can use XPath, right? And you can use JSON path on the JSON adapter and all of that. So you can kind of get, a more curated version of what you need.
Yeah.
It's very cool. And I guess, well, one question is, how often do you think people are using Google Sheets as a database? I know it's a cardinal sin to do so, but I was doing it. I'm guilty, which is how I started kind of falling headfirst into Shillelagh land. But I think we were also talking about this with Jordan from Mother Duck, that, small data is the new thing, right? And businesses across the world just keep their stuff in spreadsheets for better or worse.
Yeah. Well,
what's your perception of how often people do this and probably shouldn't?
I mean, it's a lot, right? It's like people using Excel. Today is Google. Like in the past, it was like people using Excel for things they shouldn't, and now it's people using Google Sheets. But like I criticize Google Sheets, but it has a super friendly UI. It's super easy to understand. To get started, to add values, edit values. You can make it look nice. So I think it has its purpose, and I think like there's a lot of value in these small data sets, right? There's like, if you look at distribution of data sets by volume, it's a long tail, right? You have these huge data sets that are like, I don't even know these days, but like hexabytes of data. But then you have this long tail, and this applies to any domain, right? Like, I come from oceanography. I used to be a climate scientist, and that was my main concern when I worked with ocean data. It was like, there's all these measurements that were made, like I'm from Brazil. So we had like a lab in Brazil that did a cruise in 73, and they stored all the measurements in a paper spreadsheet, or it's in an old hard disk or floppy disks, and that's data that you can't go back in time and measure again. It's actual physical measure at a 4-dimensional point, it's like time and space. And it's really important that we preserve that, right? And that's just a few kilobytes of data. Like, I remember going on a cruise for a month in 1997. We went on a cruise for a month, like a scientific cruise, and we came back with 600 kilobytes of data. That was what we collected in a month at the ocean.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's like a floppy disk. So I think there's a lot of value in making it easy for people to, translate that data into a Google Sheet and then have it being accessible.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, speaking of data, need some beer data. How's the Guinness?
It's good. This is a great beer.
Do you think the bottle's better than the can?
I think it's very different. I was actually I was at the supermarket, and the only Irish beer they had was Guinness in a can and Guinness in a bottle, and like, to me they're very different. I know the bottle is more like, I don't know, homey. It's like cozy. It feels like, and the can is, you pour in a glass. It feels like more social, more like one is an introvert, there is an extrovert, I would say. If that makes sense.
There is one. There's another variant of the Guinness bottle that's the foreign extra stout. That is like it's a weird style of stout, but it's typically from the tropics. Foreign extra, yeah. I don't know if you can buy it here in the States, but they sell it in Ireland. And
but how is it foreign then if they sell it in Ireland?
Because they don't make it in Ireland. It comes from I forget where. I'd have to look it up, but somewhere more equatorial.
Interesting.
Both the style and I think the origin of that beer are equatorial, and it's a much higher alcohol, much darker, kind of even fruitier beer, which is interesting. But anyway, Guinness aside, so I'm curious about the community effort going on behind Shillelah. Like you mentioned Airtable as a connector, and that was contributed through open source, right?
Yeah.
What sorts of open source activity are on the horizon, or what would you like to kind of recruit from anybody listening?
Yeah. So Shillelagh has an unofficial goal. So you should be able to query any URL on the internet. That's kind of the design principle, Like I want to have a library you can do select star from HTTP or even like FTP or Gemini or any protocol, and you get some data. That's kind of that's when I know it's done, when I get to that point. And I think the generic adapters, they work for XML, they work for JSON, for HTML, so they cover a lot of ground there. But yeah, but that being said, there's not a strong community. There is an issue open for like ideas for adapters. People can request their adapters, and to be honest, there's not a lot of contribution. I think because the generic JSON, the generic XML adapters, they kind of cover most of the needs in a good enough approach. I think that's kind of part of the philosophy of Shillelagh. It's like good enough is good enough, Yeah,
that's fair. The HTML one is an interesting use case, actually. People ought to know if they're using Superset that you can actually just put in the URL of a website and scrape a table. That's pretty crazy, since there's actually so many websites that have up-to-the-date tabular data, and you can just nab that through SQL, which is really cool.
Yeah.
And I know you and I talked about adding like an XPath adapter to that maybe one day, so you can grab bulleted lists or whatever else.
Yeah, and again, we talked about this, and it's more like a design. It's not hard to do. It's more like, how do you make it? Because like I said, I want it to be intuitive. I want it to be like, I want to query this website, but then how do you explain to Shillelagh that you want to use an XPath versus you're just scraping a table? But those are solvable problems. But then on the roadmap, there's not a lot of like interested in different adapters. There is like some basic stuff like supporting Python 3.12. Haven't been able to get that working yet. Mostly because dependencies, they don't work well. Shillelagh is also based on SQLite. So SQLite has this concept of a virtual table. So in SQLite, you can define a table that it's actually maps to a Python function or any function, like a C function, whatever function. But like you can define a table that access gets mapped to a function. That's how it works. So basically, you're querying a table, it gets translated to Python calls. but I have a branch where I'm adding support for Postgres also. So instead of using SQLite as a backend, which is, lightweight and you might say less performant, you'll be able to use Postgres, and then Postgres will handle all the data crunchy. Especially like if you're doing heavy aggregations or something like that, it's probably better to run them in Postgres. Those are like the big things on the list.
And I think a lot of people probably don't realize that Shillelagh is very much under the hood of Superset right now, right? So if you're parsing CSV or something like that, that's what's really happening, right?
Yeah. And like at preset, we also use Shillelagh under the hood a lot because like I said, I try to make it very friendly for the developer. So if you need to do like a custom dialect, SQL Alchemy dialect, so it's really easy to create pseudo databases, right? So at preset, when you upload a CSV, there's like a pseudo database that you upload a CSV, it actually uploads to S3, put it in S3 bucket. And then when you do metadata calls, or you do queries, it actually translates those to S3 calls, and then it queries the file. It stores as Parquet, so it gets the CSV, converts to Parquet, it stores in S3. When you run queries, you will run the queries against Amazon using S3 Select, which is an API for running queries against S3 that Amazon offers. So for the user, it's a database. They upload their files and they query their files. They have no idea there's no database. It seems like there's a database. I can go and run queries and look at the tables and do whatever I want. Behind the scenes, it's basically uploading to S3 and running queries against S3. And it's a nice solution for us because we encrypt the data in S3 with the customer key. So, it's encrypted at rest. We don't have to worry about that. And we don't have to maintain a database with customer data, which is, could be complicated. Because of isolation. So it's a simple solution. And then, like you said, Google Sheets. Superset has this, it's a terrible name, but it's called the meta database, I think it's called.
Not to be confused with the metadata database.
Yep. And because another thing people ask a lot in Superset is like, Superset allows you to connect to all your different databases. So I have my Presto here, I have my Postgres here, I have my Google Sheets here. Now, how do I move data around? How can I run a query, joining my Presto table with my my SQL table? And so Shillelagh in Superset has this concept of a superset database where every data, you can basically query across your databases, do joins and whatever you want. So that's part of Superset. I think those are the big use cases.
Yeah. And of course, for anybody listening that wants to experiment with that, there probably are some limits of reason in terms of joining across those databases using this meta database.
Yeah.
But I guess we'll figure out where those boundaries are in practice as time goes on.
Well, I think at least in preset, well, in open source too, in Superset, both Superset and preset, there are saint defaults, where you can't do a cross join from reading a million rows from one database.
Oh, it actually stops you, so it's not going to just like melt down the server or something.
Yeah. Okay. So it limits when you do a join, it limits each side to 1,000 rows by default. Of course, you can bump that. And you can also enable it per database. If you have a database that's more expensive, like BigQuery, you don't want to run something crazy there, you can just disable the meta database there.
Okay. And speaking of making more people aware of Shillelagh, I think we're about to do that. I know you and I are collaborating on a little bit of an effort that's a small part of a bigger effort. What we're working on, for anybody who's listening, and you might have heard of this through other channels, is creating a Superset community dashboard that will be an example dashboard in Superset. So starting very humbly by scraping a bunch of GitHub data so you can see kind of where things need attention, issues and PRs that haven't been touched for a long time, or gamifying things a little bit by putting some leaderboards up there and stuff like that. But we're also scraping a Google Sheet, which I'm misusing as a database, and keeping all of our tech debt stuff there so you could see like how can we kind of harden the code base by getting rid of some of these warnings and then turning the rule on to really enforce them, stuff like that. But I think over time we'll be comparing ourselves in terms of like how's the repo doing, how's CI doing, how are GitHub Actions fast or slow, and all this stuff. So there's going to be a bunch of stuff going in there, but really this is only the first of these kind of live example dashboards that we want to do. And this is going to be part of an effort of creating a whole bunch of new examples in Superset that we want to sort of crowdsource, if you will, make it a bit of a competition. And I think once we merge this new one, there's going to be a Shillelagh database in every instance of Superset when you start it up and load examples. And that'll open the door, I hope, for others, including you listeners, that you can now create data sets that are connecting to stuff on the web, basically anywhere, and start building examples around it so things stay up to date and they're much easier to build and contribute, and then we can
and also like the process, you can correct me because you went through this right for this dashboard. The process of adding a dashboard with examples to Superset is easy, right? Because like once we have your first dashboard, you can build your own dashboard using the Shillelagh database. You export it, you click, you go on your dashboard, export, you get a zip, you add that zip to the Superset repo, create a PR, and that's it, right?
That's really it. So, the Shillelagh database will be built in by then, so you don't even have to worry about adding that YAML file. But all you have to do are add the data sets, which are basically Shillelagh queries, and then add your chart YAML files, which go in a nice little folder, since Superset doesn't actually care what the folder structure of those is, and then your dashboard YAML file, and that's it.
Right, but you don't need to write those YAML files, right? You just build your dashboard live.
Yeah, build your dashboard on your preset instance or your open source Superset instance.
Yeah,
export the zip and upload it to a PR.
Add the files to a PR. Yeah, so hopefully we get a bunch of. Yeah, I always disliked the examples that come with Superset. I never had bandwidth to fix them, but I felt like they were nice in the beginning to showcase the different visualizations, but the data was stale, right? Like, I don't know. It was always like the same data that ended in 2017. And
exactly.
And that was it. There was an effort by Srini. He added newer dashboards, newer examples that look way better, but still, it's like every time you go, it's the same thing, the examples, right? So having the live data is interesting because every time you install Superset or you open Superset, your examples will have fresh data.
Yeah, I mean, so I think Shillelagh is the perfect tool for this because, it connects to things like which weather API is it?
Yeah. It's called weatherapi.com. Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah. Clever naming. But
the weather API.
So, we could build a weather dashboard and have filters that let you pick cities and stuff like that and, allow people to connect to much more current things. You can connect to tables from wiki pages and show them.
One thing I want to do, it's on my list, is to add Google Calendar as a source,
That'd be huge.
And because then, imagine you're looking at some metrics, right? And you can overlay, because Superset has support for annotations. So imagine you're looking at some metric, but then you can have as annotations a data set that is like holidays, So that's just a Google Calendar. You point to it, and then you have these holidays, and then you can understand your metric. Okay, here it went down, but there was a holiday, right? Yep, and then you don't have to worry about keeping that. Like, there are public Google calendars of holidays. You just point to one, and it's always up to date.
Yeah, that's gonna be fantastic because I think a lot of the examples right now, just by nature, they age. We've got a COVID example dashboard, and we're kind of post-COVID. It's still a good dashboard to see how to build charts.
Yeah,
it's like, okay, we need something more contemporary. So yeah, call to arms. Everybody who's listening, build a dashboard using Shillelagh and merge it onto my.
We should run like a hackathon or something, a challenge or a competition.
Well, I don't know if we're talking about this. I guess consider this a pre-announcement. We'll announce it more officially, but I think Preset is going to sponsor a bit of a global dashboard building competition.
Oh, I didn't know.
Yeah, this is going to be a whole thing. So.
Nice.
This is too early to say the details, but we do want to put some prizes behind this and do a lot of outreach so that other people can build dashboards that relate to certain industries, let's say, or just typical markets. Like, there ought to be examples built into Superset that are like marketing dashboards, sales dashboards. You should do healthcare dashboards, and inventory dashboards,
climate change,
all the things, crypto, you name it. Stock market stuff. But yeah, all of this data is out there, and I think if we build these examples, then hopefully more people in the world will see Superset as fitting their use cases, and we can grow adoption that way.
Yeah.
So that's the goal. More announcements coming soon, and we'll start waving the flag.
Sorry for spoiling that. I didn't know.
Good thing. It's good to call this the teaser trailer.
You can see the need is there,
Yeah, there's a need, and we have a tool, Shillelah. Thank you for building it. And from there, we'll just plug everybody into it and get to building. So perhaps that's the right place to kind of end this episode, is that little call to arms. Use Shillelah.
Wait, there's one thing missing in this episode.
Oh, you're right.
Yeah.
I forgot to ask this is the second time I forgot to ask the important question as a little bit of a test of character. What's on your desk?
Yeah. So today I have on my desk this.
Oh.
This is have you seen this?
I believe I have. Is that the one you had on the train years ago, or is that a newer version?
Yeah, exactly. This is the Teenage Engineering OPZ.
And for those who are not watching the video, this is a synthesizer, sampler, sequencer,
drum machine, sequencer,
above, about the size of a chocolate bar.
Yeah, or a TV remote. So it's a gray rectangle, 9 inches long, 2 inches wide, very thin, no screen. And it's amazing that it has an interface where you know what you're doing, where you are, just by lighting up numbers and LEDs, And like the UI is amazing because it will indicate where you are with color, but because some people are colorblind, it also indicates with numbers. So there's always like 2 ways of indicating what's going on, because it doesn't have a screen. And you can use your phone as a screen too. But like you said, Evan, this is a synthesizer, drum machine, sequencer, sampler. I made like whole albums just with this. You can make a whole song, and then you can record it to your phone digitally. So you plug it USB to your phone, and it will record a digital signal, super clean. And yeah, it's my favorite instrument, the OPZ.
Very cool. So for now, we'll do these little AI theme songs, but maybe going forward, we'll start writing our own. Collaboration. Very cool. Well, cheers one last time.
Cheers. Happy Friday.
Plancha. And thank you for joining us. And thank you for Shillelah. And thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Yeah, and for people listening, if you want to contribute, it's open source. You can find the repo if you Google Shillelah, which is hard to spell. Just go to Superset and you can find it. We'll post a link somewhere. But there's documentation, if you want to contribute. There's docs for developers. If you want to add support for a new API, there's like a skeleton template. There's documentation explaining like step by step. And if something's not clear, also just file a ticket, and I'm happy to help.
Yep. So start scraping that data and get a head start on this competition.
Yeah.
We'll be calling out soon.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you. See you next time, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.